My name is Vanessa and I am 34 years old. On the same afternoon a doctor told me the word carcinoma. My husband had a process server waiting in our driveway with divorce papers in a manila folder. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below, and hit like and subscribe if you have ever had someone try to walk away from you the exact moment they thought you had nothing left to fight with. It was a gray, damp Thursday in early March, the kind of Ohio afternoon where the sky never quite decides whether it wants to rain. I had spent the morning at Riverside Medical Center, sitting on crinkling paper in a room that smelled like hand sanitizer, listening to a radiologist explain a mass on a screen in language soft enough to keep me calm and precise enough to make my hands go cold. As a senior actuarial risk analyst for one of the largest insurance carriers in the Midwest, I had spent 12 years quantifying exactly this kind of moment for strangers. I built the models that predicted how families absorbed shock. I understood risk better than almost anyone I knew. But no spreadsheet could have prepared me for what was waiting in my own driveway. My husband, Adrian, was 38, a rising partner at a private equity firm downtown, a man who measured his worth in valuations and exit multiples and the size of the room he could command. He had built an identity around winning, and somewhere in the last 2 years of our marriage, I had stopped being an asset on his balance sheet and started looking, to him, like a liability. I did not know that yet. I only knew I had just been told I had cancer, and I was driving home with my hands shaking on the wheel, rehearsing how I would say the word to the man I had built a life with for 9 years. I pulled into our driveway a little after 2. The house looked the same as always, the same brick colonial with the same navy shutters we picked out the summer we got married. But parked at the curb was a car I didn't recognize, and standing on our front step, next to my husband, was a man in a gray suit holding a clipboard. I remember thinking, with the strange detached clarity that arrives in the worst moments of your life, that my brain was doing exactly what it did at work, cataloging data points before I understood what they meant. Adrian did not run to me. He did not ask how the appointment went. He stood very still, arms crossed, his jaw set the way it set when he had already made a decision and simply needed the world to catch up to him. The man beside him introduced himself as a process server and placed the folder into my hands before I had even shut my car door. I stood there on the driveway I had paid half the mortgage on, still smelling like the antiseptic wipe from my 4-line, holding a stack of paper with the words petition for dissolution of marriage printed across the top, while my husband watched me read it with an expression I can only describe as relief. Not guilt. Not sadness. Relief, the specific relief of a man who believed he had gotten out from under something expensive before the bill came due. I think it's better this way, Adrian said, before I had said a word. Cleaner. Before things get complicated. I stood there holding the diagnosis in one hand, figuratively, and the divorce petition in the other, literally, and I understood that my husband had not chosen this day by accident. He had been watching the calendar. He knew my appointment was that morning. He knew what kind of results usually followed a callback like the one I'd gotten the week before. And rather than sit with me, rather than hold my hand through the sentence that would define the next year of my life, Adrian had spent that window meeting with a lawyer, drafting a filing, timing its delivery down to the hour, so he could get out clean before my diagnosis became, in his mind, a liability attached to his name. I did not scream. I did not cry, not yet. Something in me, some old professional instinct built over a decade of pricing risk for a living, went very quiet and very still, the way a spreadsheet goes still right before you notice the formula is broken. I looked at my husband standing on our porch in his charcoal overcoat, so pleased with his own timing, so certain he had outmaneuvered a woman he assumed was too devastated to fight back, and something shifted behind my ribs that had nothing to do with the mass on the screen an hour earlier. What Adrian did not know, what he had never once bothered to ask about in 9 years of marriage, was that I had spent the last decade of my career doing precisely what he did for a living, only with something far more permanent than a private equity portfolio. I had spent it underwriting policies. I had spent it reading the fine print other people signed without looking. 3 years earlier, when Adrian needed a cosigner and a favorable premium on a business protection policy tied to his firm's partnership agreement, I had been the one who structured it, who reviewed every clause, who quietly built in language neither he nor his attorney had ever bothered to read twice. He thought he was leaving a wife who had just become a liability. He had no idea he was about to discover exactly how expensive it is to divorce an actuary. I did not answer Adrian in the driveway. I did not give him the scene he had clearly braced himself for, the tears, the pleading, the collapse that would let him walk back inside feeling like the reasonable one in a messy situation. Instead, I looked down at the petition in my hands, folded it once along its existing crease, and said only, "Okay." Nothing else. I watched something flicker across his face that I recognized instantly, because I had spent 12 years reading exactly this kind of expression on claims adjusters and policyholders alike, the flicker of a man who had expected resistance and instead received a data point he hadn't modeled for. Adrian recovered quickly. He always did. "I've already moved some things to my brother's place," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the car at the curb, as if I had asked. "We can handle the rest through the lawyers. I don't think we need this to get ugly." I noted, with the same detached precision I used at my desk every day, that he had said we don't need this to get ugly while standing on my porch with a hired stranger holding a clipboard, on the same day I had learned I might be dying. I did not correct him. I walked past both men, unlocked the front door, and let myself into a house that suddenly felt like a claims file I hadn't finished reviewing. Adrian did not follow me inside. He got into his car and drove away, and the process server got into his, and I stood alone in my kitchen holding a diagnosis and a divorce petition, and for the first time since the radiologist had turned her screen toward me that morning, I let myself sit down on the cold tile floor and cry. I gave myself exactly 11 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the microwave the entire time, some small analytical part of my brain refusing to fully surrender even to grief, counting down the way it counted everything, premiums, probabilities, time until a claim expired. At minute 11, I stood up, washed my face at the kitchen sink, and did the only thing that made sense to a person who had spent her entire career finding the exact place inside legal language where risk transferred from one party to another. I opened my laptop and started reading. Not the divorce petition, not yet. I opened the folder on my personal drive labeled Household Docs, the folder every actuary keeps without ever telling their spouse how thoroughly they keep it, and I began pulling up every policy, every account, every legal document that carried both of our names or either of our signatures. I called my sister Denise before I called anyone else. Denise was 39, a family law attorney with a practice 2 hours away in Columbus, and the kind of person who had never once in her life raised her voice in a crisis, because raising your voice, she always said, was what people did when they had already lost control of the facts. When I told her what had happened, the driveway, the process server, the timing of it all against my diagnosis, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Not shock. Calculation. "Read me the filing date and the service date," Denise said finally, her voice flat and even. Word for word. I read them to her. Another silence, longer this time. "Vanessa," she said slowly, "do you understand what he just did? He didn't just leave you. He filed and served you on the exact same day you received a cancer diagnosis, before you'd even had time to process it, in a state where timing like that can matter enormously depending on what's attached to your name financially. Tell me you have not signed anything." I had not signed anything. "Good," Denise said. "Then you have time, and time is the only thing that matters right now. Do not call him. Do not confront him. Do not let him see a single crack. We are going to go through every document you two have ever signed together, line by line, before he even realizes you're looking." I sat at my kitchen table that night with my laptop open, a cold cup of tea beside me, and my sister on speakerphone walking me through exactly what to gather, and something inside me that had gone numb in the driveway that afternoon slowly began sharpening back into focus. Adrian believed he had timed his exit perfectly, that he was walking away clean before the cost of my diagnosis attached itself to his name. What he did not understand, what a man who had never once asked to see the fine print on our own household policies could never have understood, was that I had built my entire career around exactly one skill, finding the clause everyone else skipped past, the sentence buried on page 11 that changed who paid for what, and who was protected when everything fell apart. Somewhere in the mountain of documents on my kitchen table was the exact language that was about to make Adrian's clean exit the single most expensive mistake of his life. The next morning I called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years, and Denise drove the 2 hours from Columbus with a banker's box of blank folders and a legal pad already half filled with questions. She walked into my kitchen, set the box on the table, and looked at me with the same steady expression she'd worn since we were kids, the one that used to make our own mother nervous at the dinner table. "Before we open a single document," she said, "I need you to understand something. You are allowed to be devastated. You are allowed to fall apart later, tonight, next week, whenever this actually catches up to you. But right now, for the next several hours, I need the version of you that builds risk models for a living, not the version of you that just got blindsided in your own driveway. Can you do that?" I told her I could. It wasn't entirely true yet, but saying it out loud helped make it true. We started with the business protection policy, the one I had structured for Adrian's firm 3 years earlier when he'd needed a co-signer with an insurance background to satisfy his partner's due diligence requirements. I had underwritten it myself, informally, as a favor, walking his firm's outside counsel through language they clearly hadn't read as carefully as I had. Buried in section 14, a section I remembered writing almost absent-mindedly during a slow week at the office, was a cooperation and continuity clause. It stated, in language dense enough that any non-specialist would have skimmed straight past it, that in the event either signatory initiated a change in marital status during the covered period, the non-initiating party retained first right of continuity over any jointly held interest tied to the policy's collateral assets, provided the non-initiating party could demonstrate the change was not mutually agreed upon in advance. I read it out loud twice. Denise made me read it a third time, slower. "Vanessa," she said quietly, "do you understand what this means? This isn't just a policy. You attached this language to the collateral behind his partnership stake. If he filed unilaterally, without your agreement, and you can prove it, you may have first right of continuity over an asset he thinks is entirely his." I sat back in my chair, the fluorescent kitchen light suddenly feeling very bright. I had written that clause years ago as routine due diligence, protecting my own exposure as a co-signer, never imagining I would one day be the party invoking it against my own husband. But there it was, in black and white, in a document Adrian had signed without reading past the signature line, because Adrian never read anything he didn't personally draft. He trusted his own instincts the way I trusted data, and his instincts had never once told him to double-check the fine print on a favor his wife had done for his career. We spent the rest of that day and most of the next combing through everything else. The joint umbrella policy on the house, which named me as primary holder because I had better credit at the time we bought it. The critical illness rider I had quietly added to my own health coverage 2 years earlier, after watching too many claims come across my desk from people who had nothing in place when catastrophe hit, a rider that, buried in its own dense language, contained a spousal cooperation requirement tied to continued marital status for the full benefit to vest. And the life insurance trust we had set up together in year 6 of our marriage, structured as an irrevocable trust with a 2-year contestability window that would not fully close for another 4 months. Denise kept a running list on her legal pad, and by the second night, the list had a name. She started calling it the exposure map, the exact phrase my own father, had he been an auditor instead of an accountant, might have used. Adrian had spent 9 years assuming that because he brought home the larger paycheck, he was the one holding all the leverage in our marriage. He had never once considered that leverage, in my world, was never about income. It was about who understood the risk. And I understood every single line of it. By the third day, Denise and I had built something that looked less like a folder of documents and more like an actual case file, spread across my dining table in neat labeled stacks the way I might organize a claims audit at work. But documents alone don't tell you why someone did what they did, and the question that kept circling back through both of our minds was timing. Adrian was disciplined almost to the point of obsession. He did not make impulsive decisions, not with money, not with his career, and clearly not with this. Someone that calculated does not simply wake up one Thursday morning and decide to end a 9-year marriage on the exact day his wife has a biopsy follow-up. He had known. He had planned around it. Which meant either he had somehow learned about my diagnosis before I told him, or there was another reason entirely for the timing, something that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with his own exposure. Denise, who had spent 15 years watching people's worst instincts play out in family court, had a theory almost immediately. Men like Adrian don't leave because they've fallen in love with someone else, she said, tapping her pen against the legal pad. Not usually as the primary reason, anyway. They leave because they've calculated that staying costs them more than going, and something changed the math. I want to know what changed his math this month. It didn't take long to find out. I still had access to our shared cloud calendar, the one neither of us had ever bothered to disconnect from each other's accounts because in 9 years of marriage it had simply never occurred to either of us that we might need to. Buried among his usual client meetings and gym sessions was a recurring calendar entry, twice a week, always at the same boutique hotel downtown, always labeled with the same deliberately boring name, Portfolio Review. I clicked into one of the entries out of habit more than suspicion, and found an attached guest invite from an email address I didn't recognize, belonging to someone named Elise Marchetti. A quick search told me everything else. Elise was 29, an associate at Adrian's own firm, and, more importantly, the daughter of one of the firm's largest outside investors, a man named Graham Marchetti who sat on the same investment committee that would be voting on Adrian's full partnership in exactly 6 weeks. Suddenly the math made itself obvious. Adrian was not simply having an affair. He was building a strategic alliance disguised as one, positioning himself to marry into the exact family whose approval he needed to secure the largest promotion of his career, and a wife with a serious diagnosis, a wife who might soon need his time, his attention, his presence at appointments and treatments, was not a look he could afford in front of Graham Marchetti's investment committee. I sat very still at my kitchen table absorbing this, and I want to be honest with you about what I felt in that moment, because it wasn't what I expected. It wasn't heartbreak. I had already spent the heartbreak, 11 minutes of it, on my kitchen floor 2 days earlier. What I felt instead was the particular, focused calm that used to settle over me at work whenever I found the exact clause that would decide an entire claim, the moment when confusion resolves into clarity and clarity resolves into a plan. Adrian had not just tried to leave me. He had tried to use my diagnosis as a liability to erase, timed precisely to protect a partnership vote he needed from the family of the woman he was now involved with. He believed he had structured a clean, quiet exit. He did not know that the same instincts that made me exceptional at my job, the instinct to trace every dollar, every clause, every buried motive back to its source, were now aimed directly at him. Denise did not let me act on any of it that same week, no matter how badly I wanted to. This is exactly the moment people ruin their own case, she told me, closing her legal pad the way a teacher closes a book to make a point. You have leverage right now precisely because he doesn't know you found any of this. The second you confront him, the second you let him see that you know about Elise, about the timing, about the clause in his own partnership policy, he stops being predictable. Right now he thinks he's dealing with a woman too devastated to fight. Let him keep thinking that. So I did. For the next 2 weeks, while I quietly began the first round of treatment my oncologist recommended, and while Denise filed the appropriate response to preserve my position without tipping our hand, I played the part Adrian expected. I answered his occasional texts about logistics, moving furniture, splitting utility accounts, with the same flat, cooperative tone I might use answering a routine claims inquiry. I let him believe I was simply too tired, too sick, too overwhelmed to push back. Underneath that surface, Denise and I were building something far more precise than anger. We were building a timeline. Every document Adrian had signed without reading closely came with a date, and every date could be cross-referenced against the calendar entries with Elise, against firm records Denise's paralegal quietly pulled from public filings, against the exact week Adrian had scheduled his meeting with divorce counsel, which, it turned out, was the same week Graham Marchetti's investment committee had circulated its preliminary partner shortlist. Adrian had not left me because our marriage had quietly died over 2 years the way he'd implied in the driveway. He had left me on a schedule, coordinated almost to the day with his own professional calendar, and every piece of that schedule was now documented in a folder with my sister's handwriting on the tab. There was one more discovery, the one that finally moved this from a painful divorce into something closer to what Denise carefully called, in her most lawyerly voice, a matter with additional exposure. Going back through our joint accounts, I found a transfer 3 months earlier, $42,000, moved from a joint investment account we had built together over 6 years into a private account I did not recognize, opened the same week as the very first calendar entry with Elise. Adrian had not just been planning his exit emotionally. He had been quietly funding it, moving marital assets into a separate account before ever filing, months before he had any legal right to characterize those funds as anything other than jointly owned property acquired during the marriage. In my world, we call that a material misrepresentation of assets. In Denise's world, filed the right way, in front of the right judge, it was something considerably more serious than that. I remember sitting across from her at my kitchen table on a Sunday night, the two of us surrounded by more than 3 weeks of accumulated documents, and asking her the question I had been avoiding since the driveway. What do we actually do with all of this? Denise closed the folder in front of her and looked at me for a long moment. We don't do anything with it yet, she said. Adrian built his exit around one very simple assumption, that you would either be too sick or too heartbroken to look closely at any of this before it was final. He is about to find out, in front of exactly the people whose approval he needs most, precisely how wrong that assumption was. The venue Adrian's firm chose for its annual investor gala was a restored glass conservatory downtown, the kind of place with soaring ceilings and a reputation expensive enough that every guest arrived already performing wealth for one another before the first course was served. It was, not coincidentally, the exact event where partnership announcements were traditionally made, and the exact event where, according to the calendar entries I had quietly documented weeks earlier, Adrian intended to publicly introduce Elise as his fiancée to the firm's largest investors, timed perfectly to coincide with his own name being read aloud as the newest full partner. I was not supposed to be there. Adrian had made that abundantly clear through a curt text 2 days before the event, informing me that given everything going on, it would be better if I sat this one out. I told him I understood completely. What I did not tell him was that I had already reviewed my rights as a documented co-signer on the very partnership protection policy underwriting his promotion, a policy that, per its own bylaws, entitled any listed co-signer to attend the annual disclosure meeting held immediately before the gala began, the meeting where updated financial exposures were formally reviewed with the firm's compliance officer before the celebration started. Denise had found that provision 11 days earlier, buried in an appendix Adrian's own attorney had drafted and never expected anyone outside the firm to actually read. I arrived not through the grand entrance where photographers waited to capture arriving partners and their families, but through the side door reserved for compliance staff, escorted quietly by a firm associate Denise had been in contact with for the better part of a week, a sharp, soft-spoken young analyst named Priya who worked in the firm's internal risk division and who, it turned out, had her own reasons for wanting certain numbers to see daylight. Priya had noticed irregularities in Adrian's expense reporting months earlier, small things that hadn't added up, hotel charges that didn't match his stated travel schedule, a pattern she'd flagged internally and watched quietly disappear without explanation. When Denise reached out on my behalf, laying out what we had found in Adrian's finances, Priya did not hesitate. She had already built her own file. Together, in a private compliance office 2 floors above the glittering party beginning to fill the conservatory below, the 3 of us laid every piece of the exposure map next to Priya's internal findings, and watched an already devastating picture become something closer to undeniable. The $42,000 moved out of our joint account was not, as I had assumed, simply relocated personal savings. Cross-referenced against Priya's records, it traced directly into a shell account used to cover a portion of a personal loan Adrian had taken against firm-restricted securities, technically owned by the partnership itself, to fund what his own texts to Elise, which Priya's system had flagged and archived automatically under standard compliance retention policy, openly referred to as getting the ring right before the vote. Adrian had not simply moved marital funds. He had misappropriated partnership restricted assets to finance a proposal timed to influence an investment committee vote, funded in part by money that legally still belonged, in whole or in part, to me. The compliance officer sitting across the table from us, a stern, unflappable woman named Renata who had clearly seen every version of ambition curdle into recklessness over her career, closed the folder in front of her and looked at the three of us for a long, quiet moment. "This is no longer just a marital matter," she said finally. "This is a fiduciary one. And it happens to be walking around downstairs right now, accepting congratulations." Renata did not rush. That was the thing I remember most clearly about those final 20 minutes before we walked downstairs, the sheer unhurried precision of a woman who had spent her career cleaning up other people's recklessness and had learned long ago that panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. She made 2 calls, one to the firm's outside counsel, who was, conveniently and unpleasantly for Adrian, already downstairs enjoying the open bar, and one to the head of the investment committee, Graham Marchetti himself, requesting quietly that he step away from the reception for what she described only as a compliance matter requiring his immediate attention before any announcements are finalized. I sat in that small office watching a woman I had met less than an hour earlier dismantle my husband's entire evening with the same calm efficiency I used every day pricing risk on other people's catastrophes, and I understood, finally, exactly what Denise had been trying to teach me since the driveway. Real power was never loud. It never announced itself. It simply arrived, fully documented, at precisely the moment it could not be talked away. When Renata finally rose from her chair, smoothing her blazer, she looked at me and asked a single question. "Do you want to be in the room when this happens, or would you rather I handle the disclosure and you hear about it afterward?" I did not have to think about my answer. I had spent 2 weeks being told, gently and not so gently, that I was too sick, too devastated, too finished to matter in the story of my own marriage. I wanted to be standing in the room when my husband learned exactly how wrong that assumption had been. We walked down together, Priya trailing slightly behind with a tablet holding everything we needed, Denise on the phone in the stairwell finalizing the emergency filing she would submit the following morning regardless of how tonight unfolded, and Renata leading the way with the unhurried confidence of someone who had done this exact walk before and always won. The conservatory was in full swing by the time we reached the main floor, string lights woven through the glass ceiling, waiters circulating with champagne, the low collective murmur of a room full of people congratulating themselves on their own success. Adrian stood near the small raised stage at the far end, dressed in the navy suit I had picked out for him 2 Christmases ago, his hand resting at the small of Elisa's back as Graham Marchetti's wife admired the modest but clearly new ring on her finger. Adrian looked, for the first time in weeks, completely at ease, the particular ease of a man who believes every variable in his life has finally been solved for. He had not yet noticed us crossing the room. Renata reached Graham Marchetti first, speaking quietly into his ear, and I watched the older man's expression shift from polite confusion to something sharper, something that made him set down his champagne glass and follow her a few steps away from the crowd without a word of protest. Priya moved to the small technical booth near the stage where the evening's promotional slideshow was cued to run, the one meant to showcase Adrian's rising numbers before his name was formally announced as the firm's newest partner. She said something quiet to the young technician stationed there, held up her tablet, and the young man's eyes went wide before he nodded and stepped back from his own equipment. Denise appeared at my side just as the lights near the stage began to dim for what everyone in the room still believed was the beginning of a celebration. "Ready?" she whispered. I looked across the room at my husband, still oblivious, still smiling, still certain the biggest risk in his life was behind him. "I've been ready for 3 weeks," I said. The screens above the stage, meant to display Adrian's carefully curated performance numbers, flickered once and changed. Instead of quarterly growth charts, the room was met with a clean compliance summary bearing the firm's own internal letterhead, the kind of document nobody in that glittering crowd had ever expected to see projected 12 feet tall above a champagne reception. Priya had built it exactly the way Renata instructed, factual, dated, unemotional, letting the numbers speak without a single adjective attached to them. A murmur rippled through the conservatory as guests slowly stopped their conversations and turned toward the stage, confusion visibly spreading across faces that had, moments earlier, been discussing vacation homes and golf handicaps. Adrian noticed the shift in the room before he noticed the screen itself, the particular way a crowd's attention bends collectively towards something, and when he finally turned to see what everyone else was already staring at, I watched the color drain slowly from his face. The first line on the screen was simple: a timeline of transfers from a jointly held marital account into a personal account opened the same week. Correspondence began with a firm associate. The second line was worse: documentation of a personal loan against partnership restricted securities, taken without required committee disclosure, used in part to finance a personal purchase during an active investment vote. Graham Marchetti, standing rigid beside Renata a few feet from the stage, read every line in complete silence, his jaw tightening with each new sentence that appeared. This was not simply a man learning his daughter's fiancé had been unfaithful. This was the head of an investment committee learning, in front of his most important clients, that the partner he was about to approve had misused restricted assets to fund a proposal timed around influencing his own vote. Elise, still standing near Adrian with her new ring catching the light from the screens above her, looked up and read the words slowly, her face shifting from confusion to horror as she began to understand exactly what the dates and figures in front of her actually meant. Adrian found his voice first, the way he always did, some old instinct for damage control kicking in even now. "This is a mistake," he said loudly, turning toward the crowd with the practiced charm he used to close difficult deals. "There's clearly been some kind of technical error. I'll have someone look into it immediately." Nobody moved to help him. Renata stepped forward instead, her voice calm and carrying easily across the suddenly silent room. "There is no error, Adrian. Every figure on that screen has been independently verified against firm records and account statements provided by your wife's legal counsel." The word wife landed across that room like a dropped glass. Half the guests, I realized, had already been introduced to Elise that evening as Adrian's fiancée. Nobody in that conservatory, apparently, had known he was still legally married at all. Adrian turned, finally, and found me standing near the edge of the stage, Denise at my side, Priya's tablet still glowing faintly in her hands. Whatever composure he had left visibly cracked. "Vanessa," he said, and for the first time since the driveway, his voice actually shook. "What is this? What did you do?" I did not raise my voice. I did not need to, the room was already silent enough to hear every word. "I underwrote a business protection policy for your partnership 3 years ago, Adrian. You never read it." "I read it again the day you served me divorce papers on the same afternoon I was diagnosed with cancer." A collective gasp moved through the crowd, sharper and more audible than anything the screens had produced. Even Graham Marchetti, a man who had clearly heard every excuse imaginable across a long career in finance, visibly flinched. Graham Marchetti did not raise his voice either, and somehow that made it worse for Adrian than shouting ever could have. He simply turned to the man standing beside him, someone I recognized from the earlier compliance discussion as the firm's outside counsel, and said, in the flat, final tone of a man closing an account, "Suspend the partnership vote effective immediately, and get me everything compliance has on the restricted securities loan by tomorrow morning." Then, without another glance at Adrian, he turned to his daughter. Elise was crying now, not from heartbreak, I suspected, but from the sudden, dawning humiliation of realizing exactly how many important people had just watched her accept a ring purchased in part with another woman's marital assets, from a man who was still, on paper, someone else's husband. Her father put a hand gently on her shoulder and guided her away from the stage without a word to Adrian at all, the silence somehow more damning than anything he could have said. Adrian stood alone under the lights, his charm finally, completely useless, looking around the conservatory at a room full of people who, an hour earlier, had been competing for his attention and were now visibly stepping back from him as though he carried something contagious. He turned back to me one last time, and I watched him search my face for some flicker of the woman who had cried on his shoulder after difficult days, the woman who had structured a favor for his career without ever once asking for credit. He did not find her. "You did this," he said, quieter now, almost pleading. You could have just let this happen quietly. We could have been done with this by summer. You tried to end our marriage the same day you thought I might be dying, I said. Time to a partnership vote, funded by money that was still half mine, so that you could marry into the family that controls your career before anyone found out. I didn't do this, Adrian. I just finally read the paperwork. I did not wait for a response. I turned, walked past Renata, past Graham Marchetti quietly guiding his daughter toward a side exit, past clusters of investors already pulling out their phones to call their own attorneys, and I let Denise walk beside me toward the same side door I had entered through hours earlier. Priya caught up with us just before we reached it, tablet tucked under her arm, and said only, "For what it's worth, I've been waiting a long time to do that." Outside, the night air was cold and clean after the overheated glow of the conservatory, and for a moment the three of us simply stood on the sidewalk in silence, listening to the muffled chaos still audible through the glass walls behind us, phones ringing, voices rising, the particular sound of a carefully built reputation collapsing in real time. Denise finally spoke first. "The filing goes in first thing tomorrow," she said. "Between the exposure map and what just happened in there, you are in an extraordinarily strong position, Vanessa, both for the divorce and for whatever the firm decides to do about the loan." I nodded, still staring at the glowing windows of the conservatory behind us, watching shapes move frantically behind the glass. I did not feel triumphant exactly, not the way I might have expected, not the way it might look from the outside. I felt something quieter than that. Something closer to relief, the particular relief of watching a risk you spent your whole career learning to price finally, fully, resolve itself in your favor. 3 weeks passed before I saw Adrian again, this time across a conference table in Denise's Columbus office instead of a driveway or a glittering conservatory, and the difference in him was almost startling. The partnership vote had been permanently withdrawn the morning after the gala, and within days the firm had quietly opened its own internal investigation into the restricted securities loan, an investigation Adrian's own attorney warned him could result in far more than a cancelled promotion. Graham Marchetti's committee had not simply paused, they had circulated the compliance findings among the firm's other outside investors, and 2 of Adrian's largest personal clients had already withdrawn their accounts before the week was out. Elise, I later learned through the small, satisfying grapevine of people who had watched the entire collapse unfold in person, ended the engagement within 48 hours, unwilling to have her own name publicly attached to a securities investigation just as she was beginning to build her own reputation in the industry. Adrian sat across that conference table looking smaller than I had ever seen him, his usual polish replaced by the particular gray exhaustion of a man watching every carefully constructed advantage in his life dissolve at once. He did not argue with the terms Denise laid out. He could not. The exposure map, cross-referenced against Priya's internal compliance findings, had already been submitted as part of the divorce filing, and his own attorney had advised him, in no uncertain terms, that fighting any of it in open court would only invite the kind of scrutiny his ongoing firm investigation could not survive. The house, structured under my name from the original umbrella policy, remained mine outright. The $42,000, along with a portion of Adrian's remaining equity stake, tied up through the cooperation and continuity clause buried in Section 14 of a policy he had never bothered to read, was returned to me as part of the settlement, along with a sum considerably larger, negotiated quietly by Denise in exchange for my agreement not to pursue additional claims tied to the misappropriated securities loan, a courtesy I extended not for Adrian's sake, but because dragging the process out any longer would have cost me something far more valuable than money, time I intended to spend on my own recovery instead of in a courtroom. I want to tell you something now that I did not know myself on the day this all began, something Denise did not know, something even I did not fully understand until my second round of appointments with my oncologist 3 weeks after the diagnosis first landed. The mass they found in March, the one Adrian had used to time his exit with such surgical precision, turned out to be early stage, caught remarkably early, in fact, precisely because I had been diligent for years about the same kind of preventive screening I had spent my career quietly modeling the value of for other people's families. My treatment plan, once fully confirmed, was aggressive but highly survivable, the kind of outcome oncologists describe with genuine, careful optimism rather than the softened language reserved for worse news. Adrian never asked. Not once, not in the driveway, not in any of the brief, clipped exchanges that followed in the weeks after, did my husband ask what my actual prognosis was before deciding my diagnosis made me a liability worth abandoning on a Thursday afternoon with a hired stranger and a clipboard. He built an entire strategic exit, timed to a partnership vote and an engagement announcement, around a fear he never once bothered to verify. He assumed the worst about my health and used that assumption to justify walking away from 9 years of marriage in the space of a single calendar month, and it never once occurred to him that the same instinct for careful verification that made him excellent at his job might have served him just as well in his own home, if he had ever thought to apply it there. I finished my treatment that autumn. I am, as of the recording of this, fully in remission, healthier by every measure my doctors track than I was the year I got married. I still work as a risk analyst, though I moved firms not long after the divorce finalized, taking Priya with me as a colleague after her own position at Adrian's old firm became, understandably, untenable in the fallout of the investigation that ultimately cost the company 2 of its largest institutional accounts and Adrian his job entirely. I bought myself a small lake house that spring with part of the settlement, a place with navy shutters, if you're wondering, because apparently some things about what I love never really change, only the person I choose to share them with does. This story offers something I think about often now, in the quiet moments after everything's settled, the vital importance of never assuming someone has stopped paying attention just because they are in pain. Adrian mistook my devastation for weakness, my diagnosis for an ending, and my silence for surrender, when in truth I was simply doing what 12 years of underwriting risk had trained me to do instinctively, gathering every fact before I moved, refusing to react until I understood the full shape of what I was dealing with. If you have ever had someone try to write you off the exact moment you looked most vulnerable, only to discover you had been quietly building your case the entire time, I would love to hear your story in the comments below. Denise still calls it the exposure map, half joking now, though I notice she keeps a framed printout of that Section 14 clause on the wall of her office, right next to her law degree, as a reminder to every new associate who walks through her door that the person who reads the fine print is always, eventually, the person who holds the power in the room. I think about that gala more than I probably should, not the humiliation on Adrian's face, though I won't pretend that didn't feel like something close to justice, but the quieter moment just before it all began, standing in that compliance office 2 floors above the party with Priya and Renata, watching 2 women I barely knew choose, without hesitation, to help a stranger simply because the numbers in front of them told a story worth telling honestly. That, more than anything that happened on that stage, is what I actually carry with me now. Adrian spent 9 years assuming that because he understood money better than I did, he understood leverage better than I did too, and it never once occurred to him that the quiet, careful woman reading policy documents at the kitchen table after dinner was building a kind of expertise he would one day desperately need and completely lack. People sometimes ask me, when they hear this story secondhand, whether I regret not confronting him immediately in the driveway, whether some more honest, more visceral version of justice might have felt better in the moment, screaming, throwing the papers back in his face, giving him the scene he was clearly braced for. I don't. Adrian built his entire identity around being the person who saw the angles first, who left before the bill came due, who never got caught holding the losing position in any negotiation. The only thing that could have actually mattered to a man like that, the only consequence with any real weight, was proving, publicly and undeniably, in front of the exact people whose approval he had staked his entire future on, that he had missed the one angle that counted most. Grief, I have learned, does not disappear just because you finally win. I still have hard days. I still occasionally reach for my phone to tell Adrian something small and mundane before I remember, and that small, involuntary reflex is its own kind of loss, separate entirely from the outcome of the divorce or the settlement or the gala. But I have also learned, in the year since all of this happened, that surviving a diagnosis and surviving a betrayal require almost exactly the same discipline. You gather the facts, you resist the urge to panic before you understand the full shape of what you are facing, and you trust that careful, patient work will eventually tell you the truth, even when the truth takes longer to arrive than you would like. Adrian wanted a quick, clean exit. He wanted to close the file on our marriage the same way he closed a deal, decisively, on his own timeline, before anyone could ask too many questions. What he got instead was a reminder that some files never close quietly, not when someone on the other side of the table has spent her entire career learning exactly how to read them. If there is one thing I would want anyone watching this to take away, it is simply this: pain does not make you powerless, and being underestimated, however painful in the moment, is very often the single greatest advantage you will ever be handed, if you are patient enough to use it well. Read every clause. Verify every assumption. And never let anyone convince you that your worst day is the day you stop paying attention.